Hello and welcome back to a History Rewatched episode. I just want to say we've had huge technical difficulties since the last episode that we've put out. We're coming back. What we hoped to do was episode 3 came out, and the week after we were hoping to set out this episode. We've had huge technical difficulties coming up to it. The system that we use to edit all of the parts down into one episode has completely gone. Like, we've not been able to use it recently, so we've had huge problems with that. We are trying to go back to one every week. We've got Learn About History episodes, in-depth studies. We've got an interview coming up. We are releasing that. We've had a bit of problems recently. We are getting back on track. We can promise you that we are going to be back with episodes weekly. But let's focus on today's episode. It's Learn About History. It's about the American Civil War. So let's jump. So the American Civil War. The American Civil War was 4 years long. It was between 1861 and 1865. It was between the United States and the 11 southern states that had removed themselves from the Union and started the Confederate States of America. Hence, and this is why the name that was given to them was the Confederates. So, the 11 states that removed themselves from the Union are Mississippi, Florida, South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. These all succeeded between 1860 and 1861, and the breakout which occurred included armed hostilities, which were a culmination of decades of growing friction over slavery. Now, if you don't know, the American Civil War was mainly about slavery. The North wanted it abolished because the economy of the North had rapidly modernized. It was through mainly industrial technology, but the North had heavily invested in an expansive and varied transport system, which included canals, roads, and steam transport, which helped hugely with trade. However, the South did not follow in that part. The South still relied on agricultural services, and that included major plantations. And that was based off of the reliance of the slaves, the slave trade. So instead of following the North and investing in newer technology, the South invested their money into the slave trade. So much so that they invested more into the slaves than they did their own land. And by 1860, 84% of the capital invested in manufacturing was invested in the free, no slave-holding states. Yet, to the Southerners, this slave trade was bringing in money. In 1850, the price of cotton skyrocketed. The values of slaves rose hugely. By the 1860s, the per capita wealth of Southern whites was twice that of the Northerners and 3/5 of the wealthiest individuals in the country. More and more of the Northerners, driven by a sense of morality or an interest in protecting free labour, came to believe in the 1850s this was that slavery needed to be eradicated. White Southerners feared the limiting expansion of slavery would consign the institution to certain death. Over the course of the decade, the two sides became increasingly polarized, and the politicians were less able to contain the dispute through compromise. When Abraham Lincoln, a candidate explicitly against slavery, won the 1860 presidential election, 7 of the 11 southern states carried out a threat and succeeded by organizing the Confederate States of America. In the early morning of 12th of April 1861, rebels opened fire on Fort Sumter, in the entrance to the harbour of Charleston, South Carolina. This was the first encounter that would be the bloodiest war in history of the United States of America. However, important to know that this interaction claimed no victims. After a 34-hour bombardment, Major Robert Anderson surrendered his command alongside 85 soldiers to the 5,500 Confederate troops that were trying to besiege them. With known war upon the land, Lincoln called for 75,000 militiamen to serve for 3 months. He proclaimed a naval blockade of the Confederate States, although he insisted that they did not legally constitute a sovereign country, but were instead states of rebellion. He also directed $2 million to assist in raising of troops. The Confederate government had previously authorized a call for 100,000 soldiers for at least 6 months of service, although this figure was soon to be increased to 400,000. Already, we can see that the Confederate States were already well prepared for what was coming. They had 100,000 soldiers for a constant 6 month service, and it was being increased to 400,000. However, Lincoln only had 75,000 and they only had to serve for 3 months. So already they're behind, not only in the number, but also in the time period. So let's have a look at all of the battles that took place in the American Civil War. Now, we had a look at the firing on Fort Sumter, but let's have a look at the first battle of the Bull Run. So, Fort Sumter was the first conflict of the Civil War, but the first battle took place at the Bull Run, Virginia, known as the Battle of Manassas in the Confederacy, on July 21st, 1861. The bloody encounter resulted in a Confederate victory, as well as around 2,800 Union and 2,000 Confederate casualties. The replacement of Union Brigadier General Irvin McDowell, the disarray of Federal troops, and a very uncertain future for the United States. April 1862 was the Battle of Siloa. Also known as the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, the Battle of Siloa took place in southwest Tennessee on April 6th to 7th, 1862. General Ulysses S. Grant led 65,000 Union troops against the outnumbered Confederates, who halted their attacks without knowing that the Union reinforcements were on their way. The battle resulted in over 23,000 casualties, more than any battle in American history to that point, and a Union victory, though both sides now better understood the magnitude of this war. The June to the July 1862 7 days battle. General Lee and General McClellan faced off in 7 battles at the end of the Peninsula Campaign from June 25th to July 1st, 1862. The 7 days battle ended with over 35,000 casualties total, 20,000 on the Confederate side alone, only 15,000 on the Union. And the new knowledge that the military expertise of Robert E. Lee might prolong the war more than anyone had previously thought. August 1862, the Second Battle of Bull Run. After the First Battle of Bull Run ended in a disaster for the Union, the Northern troops were struggling to gain ground in Virginia. Major General John Pope led 70,000 Union troops back to the Bull Run battleground on August 28, 1862. General Thomas Stonewall Jackson and 55,000 Confederates held off the Union advance over the next few days, and on August 30th, the Union retreated from Bull Run once again. In September 1862, the Battle of Antietam. Lee and McClellan met again only a few weeks later at Antietam Creek, Maryland. The Battle of Antietam took place on September 17, 1862, and remains the bloodiest single day in American military history, with 23,000 casualties. There was no decisive victor, although the Union did prevent a Confederate victory in Union territory, leading Lincoln to remove McClellan from command. December 1862 was the Battle of Fredericksburg. On December 11, 1862, nearly 123,000 Union troops and 78,000 Confederate troops fought in the largest Civil War battle yet. Union Major General Ambrose E. Burnside attempted to do what his predecessor, General McClellan, couldn't: take Richmond from the Confederates. However, after 4 days of combat, Burnside and the Union Army retreated back across the Rappahannock River after a devastating defeat. In January 1863, New Year's Day, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Abraham Lincoln. The order freed over 3.5 million slaves in the rebelling southern states. The Emancipation Proclamation could not be enforced during the Civil War. However, once Confederate territory came back into the Union, the slaves in that area were freed. By the end of the Civil War, all 4 million slaves in the United States were free. The Battles of Gettysburg, July 1863. Historians consider the Battle of Gettysburg to be the turning point of the Civil War. When General Lee tried to invade Union territory in Pennsylvania on July 1st, General George Meade and the Army of Potomac were able to hold him off Gettysburg. It was also the costliest in terms of human life, as more than 50,000 men died in the three battles. On November 19, 1863, Abraham Lincoln would deliver his most famous speech, the Gettysburg Address, and dedicate part of the battlefield as a national cemetery. In 1865 of April, General Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The Confederate army was exhausted. General Lee was surrounded, and his line of retreat to Lynchburg was blocked. His subordinate officers urged Lee to scatter his army and continue the war using guerrilla techniques, but it was clear to Lee that he was out of options. At 1 p.m. on Palm Sunday, April 9, 1865, Lee rode into the small settlement of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The surrender in Appomattox Courthouse actually took 3 days in total. On the first day, April 9th, Lee surrendered to Grant at the McLean farmhouse. Grant and Lee were the generals-in-chief of all Union and Confederate forces fighting across the country. Neither had the political authority to bring the war to a final conclusion. The talks between Grant and Lee at Appomattox Courthouse dealt only with the surrender of Lee's army in Virginia. Under Grant's terms, the rolls listing the Confederate officers and men were to be handed over. He states, "Will not take up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged. The arms, artillery, and public property to be packed and stacked and turned over to the officers appointed by me. Each officer and man will be allowed to return to their homes so long as they have observed their parole and the laws in force where they may reside." At 4:30 p.m., General Grant sent the following message to the United States War Department. "General Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia in this afternoon, upon terms imposed by myself." The surrender of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia left three major Confederate forces in the field: Joseph E. Johnston's army in North Carolina, Richard Taylor's army in eastern Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi, and Edmund Kirby Smith's army of the Trans-Mississippi west of the Mississippi River. Most of the Confederate forces had given up by May 1865, but it took 7 weeks from Lee's surrender at Appomattox for the last Confederate forces to lay down its arms. Peace eventually came when each of the seceded states returned to the Union and accepted the terms of which the Union was based. This meant notably that the 13th Amendment of January 1865 was accepted, which abolished slavery in the United States of America.